today I think it's important to acknowledge that we're going to be dealing with what is quite a sensitive subject in the form of sexual offences, and we do recognise that that may touch upon issues that people find upsetting or maybe experiencing difficulty with. So we want to give you a warning at the outset that that's the topic that we're covering today, and also to show that there are sources of support that are available. We've put some of those links on the podcast website, but additionally, Rape Crisis, the national organisation, support both men and women who have experienced issues at and around sexual violence and rape. And they can be contacted on 0808 802 9999. Additionally, if you're a student at Staffordshire University, you can also seek out help and support from our student union services. Hi, you're listening to Crime Tapes. This is a podcast that's about crime, criminal justice and the criminal justice system. It's created in association with Staffordshire University and hosted by the School of Law, Policing and Forensics, and each week revolves around issues to do with crime and criminality. Every episode we have an expert from an area of the university to describe their specialist research interest, and in this week's show we're joined by Laura Walton-Williams, whose expertise is around sexual violence. Today, myself, James Treadwell, Professor of Criminology in Staffordshire University, and Kyla Lawton.
Hello.
We're going to be talking about sexual violence, and in particular, the enduring failure to bring to court, prosecute and convict people in relation to sexual offences. Now, this is an issue that's interested criminologists, criminal justice researchers for a number of years. But Laura in particular has specialist knowledge both of sexual offences but also of the criminal justice system and forensic evidence submitted into court. Laura, thanks ever so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Laura, criminology's long been interested in sexual offences, and there's a broad body of work, but in particular recently we've seen the issues of sexual violence perhaps come back into society in a pretty marked way, not necessarily always in the United Kingdom and not necessarily always tied to the criminal justice system, but certainly debates about sex and sexual violence are very, very sort of marked in society at the moment, particularly in public. We've had the sort of rise of Me Too, and that has sort of brought increased attention to sexual violence. We've also got, for example, playing in the background of the US presidential election, Donald Trump using quite misogynistic language, but also in essence sort of a terminology that would suggest someone more likely to be sexual offender perhaps than President of the United States of America, which has sort of brought a focus back into society on sexual violence. Now, when we talk about sexual violence, we're talking about a whole array of different offences though, aren't we, particularly in the United Kingdom and in England and Wales. And in some ways, people aren't necessarily always familiar with that we're talking about. So in criminal justice terms more broadly, what are sexual offences?
Well, it's interesting the language that you're using there, actually, and you mentioned about language that the President uses. So I tend not to refer to it as sexual violence because one of the kind of preconceptions is that if there's been some sort of sexual contact, that in order to demonstrate that it's been an offence, that there has to be some sort of violence associated with it, which I think we'll come on to a little bit later in the discussions about kind of preconceptions and public opinion. So the kind of umbrella term, and people use different umbrella terms, but I use kind of sexual offences to kind of go all the way along the scale of inappropriate sexual behaviour, rape, sexual assaults, and I think sometimes also the legal definitions of what these sorts of offences are can sometimes be challenging to people. So the concept that only a woman can be a rape victim. So people think, well, that's not very fair because a man can equally be penetrated and, he won't consent to it. So the legal system has tried to catch up with that by changing some of the definitions. So you can sexual assault by penetration is exactly the same level of offence in terms of penalties that rape is. But some people feel quite strongly about that. So the language around sexual offences and kind of what it incorporates, and it can be things like insidious, inappropriate behaviour that is very difficult to prove. So I may feel that the way that somebody is behaving towards me is inappropriate, but they don't see that that's the case. So the concept about sexual offences and investigating it and reporting it and prosecuting it, there's a lot of grey areas, and it's not a definitive, we would say if there's been a murder, there's a body, so we know that there's definitely been an offence. With a sexual offence, it's very difficult to demonstrate exactly there's no kind of definitive evidence that says, oh yes. And I think the concept that people have historically of what a rape case is and how they're, the circumstances that are most likely to result in somebody being raped are actually very, very far from what the predominant cases of sexual offences are. So this concept that we have about, you walk down the park and somebody's going to jump out at you and it's going to be a stranger rape. Actually, in those situations, the prosecution rate associated with them is significantly higher. It's the difficulty in kind of previous relationships, intimate relationships, partner relationships, where you have those situations where you have to demonstrate that at that time there was no consent. So it's a massive, massive kind of area.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, it's an area of law and the legal system like no other in some way, because there are other areas where consent is an issue, but consent in some ways is core with sexual offences, isn't it? It's about or with some sexual offences, because again that kind of continuum that you talk about is made particularly difficult at times as well, because our media, for example, will use all sorts of terminology that are sort of all encompassing. So for example, I quite often end up talking to the students about misconceptions and misunderstandings about the very term paedophilia. So, for example, we'll see footballers, the footballer Adam Johnson, for example, described as being a paedophile, whereas in actual fact, if you look at the sort of definitions of paedophilia, it is an attraction to, or sexual attraction to, prepubescent children. He was actually targeting, young females who were under the age of consent, but very, very slightly under the age of consent. And that in itself is quite different to perhaps becoming sort of sexually fixated on very young children. And so there are kind of complexities that are played out all across society. And similarly, when we talk about sexual offences, some of the problems, for example, are we also then open up into a realm, and not long ago Kyla and I have been talking quite a bit on crime tapes about, for example, the online world. So you also have sexual offences that are sort of non-contact, that are to do with possession of imagery that's prohibited. So there are all sorts of differences, but consent still comes back in some ways to being a core issue, doesn't it? Can you explain a little bit about what we mean by consent, as it were?
So, I mean, and again, that's probably one of the issues, is what people understand by consent. And you almost have the polarising argument where you say, oh, well, how are we ever going to have sex in the future if we have to sign a contract at the time to say, oh, yes, this is definitively, I'm agreeing to do this. And that's not necessarily what it's about. It's about a trust situation where you are, consenting to have a sexual contact with an individual. And there are lots of things that cause kind of grey areas around that. So when we talk about kind of alcohol, that's one of our biggest challenges. And again, you kind of mentioned the media's kind of reporting in this, and there are some key cases where they've kind of the terminology that they use around victims and say intoxicated, or and you kind of think, well, that's not the point. The point is whether that sexual contact was actually permitted and whether they actually wanted to get into it. So there've been some really high-profile cases. So things like the Brock Turner case. So that was at Stanford University, and Brock Turner came across a young lady in an intoxicated state and raped her. And there was no kind of issue about whether it happened or not, because two people came across on cyclists and saw them in the process. But the media kind of coverage after it was very critical of the judge, because they felt that they weren't perceiving Brock Turner as a rape perpetrator, because he didn't fit the bill of what they wanted to see. He was, from an affluent family. He had excellent career prospects, and he didn't want this ruining the rest of his life. And there's a really good, if you want to read a bit more, there's the open letter from the Stanford rape victim, and she talks about the questions that she was asked when she was on trial, and you almost kind of look at that and think, well, there was no question about consent in that issue, in that case.
In the case, because Turner is a Stanford University student, as you say, from a very affluent family. In that case, the victim was unconscious at the time. So, that issue of consent, and which I think you brilliantly described in some ways, which is that giving of permission in some ways. If you are unconscious, how can you give permission to someone to have sex with you? But it is interesting, isn't it? Because there are also sort of attitudes out there, very victim-blaming attitudes at times, that will say, for example, well, if you go out with a man and you get yourself drunk into that sort of state, then you bring it upon yourself, which really are there in some ways to mitigate against that giving of consent.
Well, the problem is that's not just opinions of the general public. And I mean, the opinions of the general public are massively influential because they are the juries. However, I mean, I've seen multiple cases where judges have stated that sort of advice, and you're like, that is absolute victim blaming, and you're responsible for ensuring the legal system is put into place.
I think there is a culture of victim blaming from very early age. I think that young girls are taught from very early age that you can be a victim if you do this, if you dress this way, if you go out at a certain time, if you do as you're told. And from a very early age, you're told that you are a potential victim, and if you do engage in certain behaviours and this happens, it's going to be your fault.
You're responsible for your sexuality, whereas young men who come across you unconscious, they can't, and there very much is that social attitude, I think. The interesting thing about the Turner case in some ways is it also challenges some of our notions about where sexual violence takes place, because for Stanford University, then what interestingly happens as a result of that is there's the discussion of rape on US college and university campuses, which stems from it. And I think this is where potentially there's also something interesting going on, particularly at this historical moment, in that perhaps some have stopped associating rape with those dark alleys and pouncing strangers, but rather there's perhaps a sort of wider recognition that sexual violence can occur in a range of different places. I think it's interesting, but traditionally, and sociologists, criminologists, people in the criminal justice system will talk, for example, about the legacy of rape myths, and there are sort of enduring rape myths that sort of frame much of our thinking about the perpetration of some forms of sexual offence, particularly rape, that very much build on what Kyla was saying about how victims and offenders are necessarily sort of framed and thought about. What's meant by rape myths, Laura?
So rape myths are where people believe that rape does or doesn't happen in certain circumstances. So a good example would be that a husband can't rape his wife. And in the UK, it wasn't significantly long ago that that actually became illegal. So, and in other countries, there isn't that legal framework to protect people in those sorts of relationships.
I spoke to a guy when I was actually at college years ago, not too many years ago, but quite a few years ago. And it was in a law lecture, because I actually did law at A-level, and we were discussing rape, and he says, well, you can't rape your wife because she already consented. And I was like, what do you mean she already consented? Well, the day she married me, she consented to have sex with me whenever I wanted to. I was like, are you married? He was like, no, I'm divorced. I was like, I can see why.
So the End Violence Against Women Coalition, they've done a survey about rape myths, and they surveyed about 4,000 people. this was only in 2018, and a third of people that responded in Britain think that it isn't usually rape if a woman is pressured into having sex but there's no physical violence. And you think, actually, as a country, we put ourselves as, developed. We've got these kind of quite accepting views, and yet we still have kind of massive proportions of people that still think that it's okay. The most recent one probably that's come into discussion is stealthing. So stealthing is where you're having consensual sex with somebody with a condom, and partway through the act, the male removes the condom and you continue to have sex. And that's a really divisive thing where people are saying, well, is that a sexual offence? Is that not? And it's like, well, based on the determination that consent is the key aspect, you consented to have sex in these situations. But in that End Violence Against Women survey, 40% of people thought that if they'd had sex without a condom when she's asked for one to be used, then it's not rape. And you kind of go, that's the issue, is these myths surrounding it.
And particularly one of the rape myths that's long been talked about in criminology does relate to victims' appearance and how
what they're wearing,
and that's and that in particular has even come to the fore in court cases where judges have said the victim was dressed provocatively or they're wearing a thong. So we're not necessarily talking about just one segment of society. This runs a whole sort of continuum of how people perceive and think about.
And I think another one that there's a couple of things that I often get when I'm talking, because I talk a lot about this quite a lot. I talk about it with my family and friends, and there's a couple of things. The first one is false reporting. False reporting always comes up in relation to, well, there's quite a high proportion of people that cry rape, but it hasn't been rape, and there are people that do that. But of all of the cases that are reported, it is minute. And actually, those are the cases that have been reported but will never make it through the criminal justice system. The issue is, from my perspective, is the number of people that don't report. And then the other one is that, and it predominantly works around kind of historic sexual offence cases. And they say, oh, well, they're only doing it to get their 5 minutes of fame. So things like the Bill Cosby case. My response to that is, can you tell me a single victim's name in Jimmy Savile's case, in the Bill Cosby case? So it's not necessarily understanding victim behaviour and why somebody wouldn't necessarily come forward to report a sexual offence. But those, they're very kind of common, unfortunately.
And monetary reward is another one that in some way, shape or form, because what we do know about the reporting of any sort of sexual offence is it's going to leave the person open to an awful lot of scrutiny, of very intrusive essentially engagement with the state. And so we've seen that debated recently, for example, because, and I think again in part this relates to something we've talked about on other occasions, and changing social norms, for example, about the handing over of mobile phones. So if you make an allegation of sexual offences, and I think in many ways it simply relates to the way in which the world is changing in terms of communication now, but the police having access to the victim's mobile phone, and that again has sort of polarised people who are like, well, if you've got nothing to hide, why would you not hand over your phone? But again, the complexities around the very issue of consent are such that you could behave in one way on social media platforms, but it does not necessarily mean that you haven't then been sexually assaulted or raped in a different...
I was going to say that I think one of the biggest myths and one of the biggest problems as to why we have this such level of victim blaming is because rape has been seen as very much as a woman's issue. It's women that get raped, and as women have always been controlled by the state, micromanaged by partners, fathers, uncles, and they always seem to seek the blame in the victim because it's a woman. However, if we can get past that myth that it's just women, that men can be raped and sexually assaulted by other women as well, not just other men, that possibly that might break down a bit and we might stop blaming the victim all the time when that victim can be a man.
And I think it goes, there is definitely a gender equality issue. And a lot of the time when we talk about sexual offences, the sexual aspect is only and it sounds ridiculous, but it's only a small proportion
of it.
It's
power.
It's the power dynamics. And I think sometimes that's quite hard for people to understand. It's also, and when you were just talking then, it reminded me of the kind of Rotherham cases where people didn't believe the victims because they were not in a position of power. And also what you were saying about the way that they behaved didn't fit the stereotype of, oh, you're a victim, because they were engaging in this behaviour.
Yeah, you have good victims and bad victims.
Indeed, apparently so.
Well, the Rotherham case that you were talking about is absolutely sort of classic of that. And those that don't know, the Rotherham case, a very sort of pronounced case of child sexual exploitation, sometimes talked about in terms of grooming gangs. It became very sort of emotive. I think we've mentioned it previously. No, I similarly don't like that term. I do think, but in particular, one of the things I always go back to in that case, and I think it's really interesting that it's overlooked in such a spectacular way, because there's very much this fixation with who the perpetrators were. I think there's much more understanding to be gleaned in some way if we understand who the victims were. They were young, vulnerable females, largely, living an awful lot of their life under either supervision of social services, being detected by the police out late at night. They were drawn to sort of the late night economy, and particularly sort of places that were open into the sort of early hours of the morning, because they didn't want to go home. They didn't want to go back to children's homes in some cases. So there's that vulnerability is there in so many of those sort of cases. But interestingly, what happened, particularly in the first instance in the Rotherham case, was the police treated them as a problem in terms of antisocial behaviour, in terms of criminality. So when you look at the girls that were involved, they quite often had extensive criminal records and hadn't even been regarded as victims. And I think there's something much more interesting in that in some ways than this fixation about who were the perpetrators, because the thing that always comes out, or that frequently does come out in some of these cases, and the Savile case we mentioned previously as well, is that vulnerability and being quite vulnerable is almost a sort of green light to some quite predatory individuals who know that is going to mitigate against the risk of them being detected.
Talking of green light, and it's how many sex workers are subjected to horrific sexual violence that will not go to the police because I'll be arrested for sex work, and they are often preyed upon. They're like a first port of call for serial rapists, because it's like, well, these women are asking for it anyway. I've paid for this. I can get away with this, and no one's going to listen to them because this is essentially what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why schemes like, for example, ugly mugs and so on, where they are backed by the police, can be kind of particularly successful in pointing out who... Because the other thing is, and it's one that I know from working in the criminal justice system, there's almost this sort of myth that there's a criminal specialism when it comes to any types of offending. And what frequently I find, actually, is that isn't the case at all, that people who would, commit quite serious sexual offences might have a history of driving offences, burglary convictions where they were younger, that actually there was quite a degree of criminal versatility. But similarly, this notion of sort of sexual offenders offending against one group. And
it's also what people believe that a sexual perpetrator is going to look like. They don't believe that it'll be somebody that has a family. There's been a couple of high-profile
Stanford University student, for example.
Well, celebrities. They just do not want to believe that is possible. And Bill Cosby's a fantastic example of that, where
Rolf
people
Harris.
Rolf
I
Harris.
know people that still say no, not Rolf, he was part of my childhood.
There was a celebrity case where somebody else who they'd worked with in a film was interviewed, and they said, "Oh, what do you think about this?" And the lady said, "I can't talk about it." She says, "I'm still too shocked, and also I don't think it's fair on the victims for me to make any comment about this, because I'm still trying to come to terms with it. So I really don't feel that it's appropriate." And I was like, that is good, because what she's showing is that she doesn't just believe her friend because it's her friend, and that, I can't possibly believe that he would ever do anything like that. because that's often how people get away with it, because they go, well, nobody's going to believe me because I'm an upstanding citizen.
Look at Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
And his marathon running and
that's it. I'm a good
charity
person.
work and in with the royal family.
Well, it goes back to that good perpetrator. You said good victim, bad victim. Good perpetrator, bad perpetrator.
Exactly.
We've got somebody, you've got somebody who, wearing a flasher Mac and things like that. Oh, you fit the profile of what I anticipate a sexual perpetrator.
Yeah.
Whereas, upstanding person who raises money for charity, they couldn't possibly do anything wrong.
Or good looking.
Yes.
Good looking's one as well. Very good looking men don't need to rape women.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, these are sort of extensions in some ways of some of the myths, because that sort of attitude. Oh well, they could have access to women. Why would they need to? It shows a sort of sentiment towards sex, and even in the terminology of need, doesn't it? That people are
it's to do with
driven
and
absolutely, which is very interesting. But when we were talking about that sort of that general climate that emerges and changes attitudes towards sexual behaviour, perhaps the biggest of those developments, and the ones that people will know about, has been the Me Too movement, and it particularly sort of started off with social media, and in particular tied to the film producer Harvey Weinstein, which very much sort of links celebrity, privilege, sexual offences together in a complex way. Can you tell us a bit about Me Too, Laura, and what happened?
So actually the whole concept of Me Too was much older than that. It came out, a celebrity put on social media and said, actually, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say this has happened to me. And if anybody has found in this industry that this has happened to them too, please respond. And it absolutely snowballed from there. It was a massive, massive kind of initiative, I suppose, and it kind of raised the pervasive nature of sexual kind of harassment within this industry, and the fact that there was a perception that if you wanted to get ahead, then you should just shut up and nobody's going to believe you. I have the power to influence your career. And what came out of that was massive amounts of kind of support for the victims, and identifying that actually the way that he had behaved was entirely appropriate and, in fact, illegal. What's interesting is what's come out of that. So, again, last year, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership did a study, and they asked people about whether they'd heard of the Me Too thing and whether it had had a positive impact on women in and girls, whether it made no difference or whether it had a negative impact, or they'd never heard of it. So in Great Britain, like 40% of people said that they felt that it had a positive impact. 16% of people thought that it had a negative impact. And if you go on social media, you'll see these kind of people that are very critical about it. Interestingly, in the United States, 37%, so about the same percentage of people thought that it was a positive impact, but 31% of people thought that it was a negative impact. And of those people, the majority of that was Republican voters compared to Democratic voters.
Interesting.
Which puts the political
dimension of and it's interesting, isn't it? Because there are sort of several backlashes, and I mean, on one hand, I know that there are some people who were sort of skeptical or questioning of the Me Too movement, because there was some pushback as well, because others sort of felt that in some ways what it did is it accorded sort of privileged and status women an opportunity to talk about. There's been a lot of
backlash to the fact that it wasn't very intersectional. Yeah. And in the big high-profile cases, it seems that yet again, women of colour would not be, and the one woman that Harvey Weinstein would not admit to was a woman of colour.
But if you look at the person, and I can't remember what her name is, I apologise. The lady that started it
Rose McGowan, wasn't it?
No. The original lady
was a black lady.
Yes. Yeah. But also the Times magazine article. So on the back of this, the women who had been victims of sexual offences were the Times People of the Year, and in that they interviewed people about at all different kind of social levels. So they were very clear about the fact that yes, it started off as as a celebrity kind of raising that issue, but there were people who were cleaners in hotels, and they were saying about the behaviour that had kind of happened to them. So whilst the spotlight was kind of raised on that, what you kind of hope for is that actually in raising that, everybody then starts to look at their behaviour and goes, actually, this is happening at every level. Now, a lot of large organisations don't want to think that happens because it's a very difficult solution. It's a difficult thing to fix, and it's not something that's going to be quickly fixed. But it causes an absolute change in culture, and we know in certain industries this sort of behaviour is almost tolerated or kind of said, oh well, that's just part of this industry.
Fashion industries and all.
Yeah, well, if you look at where there have been sort of scandals in the past, the fashion industry is one that has been exposed on sort of several occasions because again, again, interestingly, it changes some of our perceptions, but it tends to be dominated by quite privileged, wealthy, older men who then have access, and again, it's a way that often we don't necessarily think about, but works for all types of offending. It is in some ways also about access and opportunity, and the more sort of privileged that someone is in some ways, the more insulated or isolated they are from taking responsibility of their behaviour at times, which brings me on to a case that perhaps we don't think about as sexual offences in quite the same way that Kyla highlighted, because we were talking particularly about rape and how in instance of rape consent is paramount, but there's an interesting case which very much comes down to those that we wouldn't necessarily associate with sexual violence and issues of consent, and that is the Special Demonstration Squad of the Metropolitan Police and their forming relationships with activists. Now, one of the key elements of consent is that you have to be able to make a decision to essentially permit or agree to the conduct of another based on openness, transparency and honesty. Now, that wasn't necessarily what happened in this case.
Yeah, I think probably the most high-profile one is the Mark Kennedy case. He was a former London Metropolitan Police officer who, whilst was in the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, infiltrated protest groups from around 2003 to 2010. And he was actually unmasked by political activists as an undercover police officer. Now, during that time, he had a relationship with a woman and had children together. So you've got that. If you frame it from that perspective, when you're talking about sort of like, the police involvement and things, it's like if this is seen as acceptable, it's acceptable to start relationships with women and actually father children with women to get information for whatever the greater good is. If that is a culture, then that's something that needs looking at. And also, as getting back to what you said before about being, the sort of opportunity and the privilege, that's a privileged position. He had the opportunity. And also, if you look across the board at the most privileged in society that engage in these behaviours, you'll find that they are the sort of people who judges would identify with. They would be in their social circles, their golf clubs, and this would be more of a case for them to say, I don't think that's correct, I couldn't see him doing that. Or they're of the generation where they still believe that it's okay to rape your wife, because for years it kind of was. Yeah, it was that culture around it.
I think it's the kind of, and it's a really difficult conversation to have because we can't generalise against a massive organisation because of the way that certain people behave. Because, there have been instances very recently of police officers who have been found to have inappropriate images of children on their laptops, and they work in this environment. And I think what that kind of identifies is, which is a little bit different to the point that you're making, is that actually perpetrators of these sorts of offences are everywhere. Not everywhere. I don't want to start a panic, but they are kind of at every level. They can be found everywhere. Yeah, they can be found at every level of society. So we can't kind of say, actually, if we just get rid of this process, that will help that. I mean, another good example is kind of we have these like security checks, but you can get through that, and if you are very good at what you do in relation to the criminal activity that you do, then you're not going to be detected on that. So there are kind of security processes in place that you can circumnavigate to get what the behaviour that you want to achieve. The issue we have is when organisations either allow
it's the way they tackle it is the issue.
Or they don't address it.
It's the way it's not addressed or pushed under the carpet.
Yeah.
In the case of, in this particular case with the Metropolitan Police, I mean, organisationally, in some ways, it goes right to the top. And it's something I talk about with students because, in essence, what happened with those undercover officers, and Kennedy was only one of several, they essentially, they were permitted to do certain things by the state. So they took the false identities of dead children that they then set up, they established cover stories. And there's also that there were also debates about whether they were appropriately advised about the forming of relationships. So did the police as an organisation sort of turn a blind eye to the fact that they were forming sexual relationships with the females involved, and did they give them the right legal counsel, for example? I mean, if you are being told that this is part of your job and it's permitted to be staying over at night with the target, as they would probably have been described, does that open up but it is interesting when we come back to that issue of consent, though, because while their conduct, and there was a debate about whether their conduct amounted to sexual offences, and ultimately the authorities decided that it didn't. But if we look at the sort of narrow definition of consent, if in any other circumstance as a female you had found yourself with a man who had assumed an entirely fictional backstory and had formed a relationship with you that was based on that, and you'd had sex with them, that level of deception in some ways could essentially remove the consent that you'd given. There is clear
you have to talk about the power dynamic in that as well. Because we're not just talking about some guy decides he's going to be an airline pilot and dresses as one and tells some woman this is what he does, and every weekend he pretends to fly off somewhere just to make himself look better. We have to talk about the power.
But we have seen that where, and there have been interesting cases where, for example, because it is much more about sexual offences more generally, we've seen interesting cases, for example, where a female pretending to be a male with a prosthetic penis has been jailed for essentially the pretense of being male. So that deception in some instances is part of the very framework for sexual offences, but on the other side it's part of the very apparatus of the state. So it does in some way show that real complexity.
And it also comes kind of related to the fact that the actual intent of the crime may not have been sexual in the first instance, but because sex was involved, it then becomes a sexual offence. And the kind of sorts of cases that you're talking about are exactly that. It's that they may not have gone in thinking, oh, this is what I'm aiming to do, but it became part of it, and then it becomes the difficulty of, okay, well, how, if we were going to charge somebody, what would we be charging them for? And then that's also kind of related to the media's responsibility for how that's reported, and the public's understanding of how people are prosecuted. So it's. I mean, I really enjoy talking about sexual offences because I think it makes people think about, okay, well, actually, this is why it's quite a challenging area to prosecute, because there is such a massive complexity of scenarios that it makes it very difficult to be this black and white legal issue.
Absolutely. Played out in the real world, it is where moral, ethical debates.
Thing with that one as well that we taking, what we're not considering is we're taking the consideration of the woman's feelings. What about the child?
Yeah.
There's another innocent involved there. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
How do you rationalise that growing up?
Reconcile yourself to the fact that you were conceived under
false pretenses.
Yeah. And again, when we get
did
into,
my father actually love me, and did he love my mother, or what? Do you know what I mean?
And when we get into that realm, it's also interesting then how sexual offences can be tied to much broder debates, big issues. So, for example, if you look at Alabama at the moment on the abortion laws, and
then that takes it back to the issue about equality and who's making decisions about. They're massively intertwined issues. And when I talk about, people come and say, well, how can we improve reporting rates in the sexual offences world? And I said, there are challenges at every single stage. The first stage is actually having open discussions about it and challenging your preconceived ideas about it, because if you don't, nothing's going to change. So we can't just fix the Crown Prosecution Service. We can't just fix the police. We can't fix, people to stop the perpetrators. What we need to do is address the issues that are causing those things to occur. So, for example, unless there is a good chance that the case will be upheld and the person will be found guilty, the CPS will not progress it, because there are certain measures that they have to adhere to. So if us as the jury, if the public as the jury are unlikely to think, okay, well, that person has been the victim of a sexual offence because of our preconceived ideas about how they've been behaving, then they're not going to be able to change that, because there's no driver for them to do that. So it's a very, very complex issue, and kind of starting to talk about it, and also listening and believing people when they talk to you about it, even if you kind of feel that doesn't seem like it could be believed, is probably the greatest start to these sorts of discussions.
Well, it seems that better understanding, better education, better knowledge is a core part of that, and I certainly think that having listened to this, people will have a much better understanding. So, Laura, thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.
So if you've been interested in the themes that we've been talking about today, you might want to check out our website, www.staffs.ac.uk, where you can find details about all sorts of courses, including criminal justice related courses in policing and forensics at the School of Law, Policing and Forensics at Staffordshire University. All that it remains for me to do now is to say thank you once again to Laura Walton-Williams. Laura, thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to Kyla as well.
Thank you and goodbye.
Also, a huge thank you to Adam Buckridge, who supplies the music for this podcast.